to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner. I'm here to continue in our study on servant leadership. Now, this particular scholar, Spears, identified 10 characteristics of servant leadership. And the last time we were together, we talked about 5 of those characteristics. Today, we're going to talk about the other 5 and maybe a few more things to help us get a broader view of the term servant leadership. As I said last week, that as we've gone through this study and this series on leadership, we have a lot of different theories that are out there about leadership. Probably some, again, that you've never heard of, or that it may have, or you have heard of them, but never saw how they really apply to your station in life. My goal in doing this series on leadership is provide for you a buffet of options. The kind of options to say, yes, I like this style of leadership. Let me glean from that. Let me glean from this. Or let me have a better understanding of that. The goal also is to better equip you to be the best kind of leader for the followers, whether they be in faith or whether they be in community organizations. So we're going to start with servant leadership part 2. Let's get right into it. And in servant leadership part 2 of core values for faith and community leaders, let's start unraveling the second 5 items or the second 5 characteristics of servant leadership provided to us by Spears. Conceptualization. Conceptualization is one of those characteristics of servant leadership that refers to an individual's ability to be a visionary. Visionary for what? For an organization. And if a person is going to be a visionary for an organization, they need to provide they need to have or provide clear sense of its goals and directions. Every visionary, whether they're in a faith or community situation, should be able to provide a clear sense of what the organization's goals are and the direction whereby it is headed. This characteristic goes beyond the day-to-day operational thinking to focus on the big picture. Sometimes we can get caught up in life and get caught up in the work that we do, that we're just getting by. And we never stop to sit down and think about what the big picture is. As a servant leader, conceptualization is that ability to sit down and grasp what the big picture is and then be able to communicate that to your followers. Conceptualization equips servant leaders to respond to complex organizational problems in creative ways. Sometimes we're faced with situations in our churches and some in our organizations that bring what I call a pop-up, like a pop quiz or pop-up challenges. Or when we were in the military, there was things that we call pop-up targets. Things that would come out of nowhere that really challenge your ability to handle what's in front of you. And so sometimes as a servant leader, the characteristic of conceptualization equips that servant leader to respond to complex organizational problems in creative ways and enabling them to deal with intricacies of the organization's relationship to its long-term goals. So I'm going to deal with this problem, and how does this relate to the long-term goal? Foresight. Well, foresight encompasses a servant leader's ability to know the future. Now, what I mean by that is, I'm not saying that servant leaders have a crystal ball out or tarot cards or some other prophetic or predictive device or have some hookup to a psychic hotline. But when we talk about foresight in this particular case, we're talking about the ability to predict what's coming based on what is occurring in the present and what has happened in the past. So that type of foresight is in a servant leader means that that servant leader really pays attention. They've done their homework. They look and they've seen what has happened in their organization in the past, and that can also tell them what will happen in the future. And that's a different kind of foresight rather than, just a hunch. You're really looking at what's going on. You're really paying attention to what's happening. And so, just like each of us, we all have human bodies. We all have a body. And our body pretty much tells us what we need to do. When you've been burning the candle at both ends, your body tells you that you need to get some rest. So we become cognizant of the things that our body tells us. As a servant leader, we are cognizant of our organization. We're cognizant of our tasks. We're cognizant of our position. And we are also aware of things that could be coming based upon what we've learned and what we've seen in the past. When Greenleaf talked about foresight, he applied an ethical dimension, which he believes that leaders should be held accountable for any failures to anticipate what reasonably could be foreseen and to act on that understanding. That's what Greenleaf implied about foresight, that he believes that leaders should be held accountable. In other words, we should really be in the know, especially if it's something that has happened in the past. So that poses a challenge. Am I really in the know? Have I done my homework? Have I looked at the cycles and seasons that are occurring in my organization? And if I know the season, then I know the reason. If I know the time and the season that we're in, whether it be a rough time or whether it be a happy time, at least I can predict about what's coming down the pipe. When I think about being able to understand and comprehend things, let me just deviate for a moment and let's talk about a relationship that the scripture outlines between Moses and the children of Israel. And the scripture says in the book of Psalms that Moses knew God's ways where the children of Israel knew his acts. And so the idea is that there's something to be differentiated between knowing God's ways and just knowing what God can do or just knowing what God has done. When you know somebody's ways, you're familiar with their MO, their modus operandi, and you can kind of predict what's going to happen. So from that standpoint, if we know how God has operated in our lives, that should teach us something, that we should know how he's at work in our organization. And furthermore, we should also naturally know the times and seasons. So we can really predict what's going to happen and what's occurring based upon what we already see occurring or what has occurred in the past, especially the last time that we had a situation that emerged like this. So let's move on to the next characteristic, which is stewardship. Now, stewardship is about taking responsibility for the leadership role entrusted to the leader. Are you taking responsibility for the role that's entrusted to you? Or are you blaming other people for the problems that you have right there at your doorstep? Servant leaders accept the responsibility, watch this, to carefully manage the people and organization that they've been given to lead. In addition, they hold the organization in trust for the greater good of society. So they accept the responsibility to carefully manage the people in the organization, and they hold the organization in trust for the greater good of society. Commitment to the growth of the people. When Dr. Greenleaf talked about this, he conceived that servant leadership places a premium on treating each follower as a unique person with intrinsic value that goes beyond their contributions to the organization. Keep in mind that servant leadership, in Greenleaf's perspective, he saw that treating the follower, having a high regard for the follower, and seeing them as a unique person, and seeing them as individuals with intrinsic values, especially the kind of values that goes beyond his or her tangible contributions to the organization. In other words, Greenleaf was big upon the servant leader seeing that follower bigger than what they may have thought themselves to be. This brings us to this second point about commitment to the growth of people. Servant leaders are committed to helping each person in the organization to grow personally and professionally. They're committed to helping each person in the organization to grow personally and professionally. Now, a caveat to that is this. If that servant leader is committed to you growing professionally and personally, the follower must be open to a servant leader that's trying to build them up, that's trying to plus them up, that's trying to help them reach a little bit higher. So where the breakdown in servant leadership would be here. If the follower is not willing to grow personally and professionally, then this particular style of servant leadership is not working. So we got to look at the pros and cons. So if we look at it from that perspective, this idea of servant leadership is a cooperation between the servant leader and the followers. They must work hand in hand in order for servant leadership to be effective, especially not only for the individuals, but for the good of the organization. So when a servant leader is committed to helping each person grow, that type of commitment can take on many forms, which includes providing followers with opportunities for career development, helping them to develop new work skills, and taking a personal interest in their ideas and involving them in the decision making. So you want a servant leader is looking for ways to help that person grow professionally. They don't just want to keep that person in one spot. This is as far as you go. This is what, we've all probably been familiar with dead-end jobs. You get on a job to where it's like all you are able to do is what they have in front of you, and they don't have any progression for you. And we've all had those kind of opportunities presented to us. When you're in a servant leader looks for opportunities, or you may have organizations that model the values of servant leadership that are looking for ways by which their employees, by which those members of their organization could grow personally and professionally. And again, this concept of servant leadership is big on personal interest in the ideas of followers and involving them in decision making. Now that's a shift, as it were, to involve the followers in decision making, especially if you are in an organization, or especially if you're the kind of leader that you feel like that you need to be the one to really say it's got to be this way or that way. And I'm not saying that there aren't times that we can be direct about how we want things to be done. But from the concept of servant leadership, it's not always about you. It's really about the team. It's really about the followers and relying upon those followers to give you valuable input that speaks to the mission, that speaks to the direction that the organization is headed. Well, let's talk about building community. This is another characteristic that a servant leader involves himself in. They focus on the development of community. Now, clearly, a community is a collection of individuals who have a shared interest and pursuits, and they feel a sense of unity and relatedness. Community allows followers to identify with something greater than themselves that they value. So when we think about this, that a servant leader builds community, they build an atmosphere whereby the people feel a sense of unity and relatedness. People enjoy, following this particular direction, or serving in this particular organization, or following this kind of leader. So the servant leader does have value, and it does work in some phenomenal ways, but it does require a shift in thought if the leader is used to operating in some more demonstrative or more direct approaches toward their followers. Servant leaders, they build community, as we see here, but they also do it to provide a place where people can feel safe and connected with others. Well, obviously, clearly, that's if you're a person of faith, the church is supposed to be a place where people feel safe and connected with others. But here's the other aspect of this. Not only do they create a place where the followers feel safe and connected with others, but it also allows space for others to express their own individuality. Now that takes some insight. That takes some skill to do that, because sometimes organizations do not allow you to express your individuality. They say it's this way or it's the highway, and but in a servant leadership situation, it allows for that individuality. And people like to feel good about themselves, and they don't like to feel oppressed. And sometimes, you can have organizations that they operate in such a way they might be effective in getting the job done. They might be effective in dealing and addressing the bottom line, but the people feel like that they are oppressed. They feel like that they're in a slave type situation, and the job is merely a plantation that provides a paycheck. And so in a servant leadership role, people feel safe, they feel connected, they enjoy working there, they enjoy being there, they don't dread going to work, they don't dread being around or involving or contributing their gifts, and they are allowed to express their own individuality. And I like that concept that comes along with that. It doesn't deny that person's individuality. Well, now there's some misgivings about servant leadership, and I'm quoting this from Gandolfi, Stone, and Deno in an article that they talked about in leadership in 2017. And this is what they said: that humility and weakness of a servant are seen as, let me correct that. Humility and meekness of a servant are seen as weak and ineffective in a society where domination, oppressive strategies, and individualism are stronger values than humility, collectivism, and sharing of power and authority with others. Let me say that again. The humility and meekness of a servant are seen as weak and ineffective. Where? In a society where domination, oppressive strategies, and individualism are stronger values than humility, collectivism, and a sharing of power and authority with others. The question that we've got to ask, are we living in a society that really values servant leadership? Or are we living in a society where domination, oppressive strategies, and individualism are stronger values than humility, collectivism, and sharing of power and authority with others? I'm just simply asking a question that we can look at the society we live in and compare it with the values that we're learning about servant leadership, and maybe we can see where some of our problem is at. Maybe we're too big, as my mom said, for our britches. Maybe we're looking through a lens that says, I've got to be in charge. It's got to be run my way. Maybe we're not looking at the values that can come from those that we lead, or the kind of empowerment that comes through service rather than comes through coercion. Another misconception is the leadership and servant. Because sometimes people don't know what a leader is, and sometimes people don't know what a servant is. And as we learned in our first segment on servant leadership, that it is an oxymoron that to be where a leader is a servant, because a leader is expected to lead and a servant is expected to follow. So these misconceptions of leader and servant combine to result in a wrong understanding that servant leaders engage in, number one, a lackadaisical or laissez-faire style of leadership. The truth is, servant leadership is not disengaged. Servant leadership is not weak. It is not lackadaisical. That is, lacking in enthusiasm and determination. Servant leader is not laissez-faire. That is, it does not allow things to go on their own course. In other words, without interfering. In other words, you just kind of let things play itself out. Laissez-faire, that's the type of leadership that doesn't interfere. And so servant leadership is neither one of these. But on the opposite end, servant leaders are what? Proactive. They're not reactive individuals. They are proactive. They're ambitious. And they're driven just like any other leader. So, most leaders are proactive. Most leaders are ambitious. And most leaders are driven. But the focus of their drive differs from all the other leaders that we've talked about. And what differentiates a servant leader from the other styles of leadership is their primary focus on the followers first. This is taken from Stone, Russell, and Patterson in one of their articles that they stated. They focus on followers first. And if there's nothing that we take away from servant leadership today, please regard that they focus on followers first. So here's some other characteristics. Most styles of leadership direct their focus first on mission and second on empowering followers to achieve that mission. Servant leadership directs its focus first on the ability of the individuals to succeed, and second on the success of the mission. So a servant leader is focused upon making sure that the individuals that are part of that organization, or those followers, that they succeed. Because the understanding is, if the followers succeed, guess what? The mission is successful as well. When we look at servant leadership in this way, servant leaders serve those who follow their lead, and collectively with their teams serve organizations or missions. So while the servant leader is focusing upon building up the individuals that follow, as a team, they're able to direct the organization and the mission to its objective or its goals for success. This leadership, that is servant leadership, reveals strength through discipline and humility, which is often demonstrated through the leader's ability to put their own needs after that of those they serve. I'm going to say that again. Servant leadership focuses on strength through discipline and humility, which is often demonstrated through the leader's ability to put their own needs after that of those that they serve. Again, it's the followers first. Finally, servant leaders accomplish organizational mission by helping their followers develop and succeed. So you can see here that there's a lot of repetition and a lot of reiteration that servant leaders accomplish their organizational mission by helping their followers to develop and succeed. And sometimes in helping our followers to develop and succeed is sitting down with our followers and asking them what are their aspirations in life, or what is it that they would like to accomplish in the organization. What are their goals and dreams? What do they think that they can bring to the table? And what is it that you need from me to help you get to where you need to be? And so that takes discipline, and it does take the kind of humility to really sit down and listen to what people have to say. Well, let's talk about Jesus, the model servant leader. And I want to invite you to the book of Mark and chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. And just before we start reading here in 42, but we find that there was a story. There was a mother whose ambition and desire was that when Jesus came into his kingdom, that on the right hand, one of her sons would be, and on the left hand, one of her sons would be. That is what she wanted. And so when, so Jesus said, he asked them, are you able to drink of the cup that I'm able to drink? And they said, yes. And he said, you will. Are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? And they said, yes. And he said, you will. But to place you on my right and on my left, that's not mine to give, but my Father which is in heaven. And so when word got back to the other 10 disciples that these two had this ambition, which really was their mom that was really pushing the issue, they became angered. But this was Jesus' response. And he said this, when he contrasted, how they were to lead and how others around them were leading. This is what he said. You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. And whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. And so what Jesus was talking about there was a kind of leadership style that he saw that existed in that Greco-Roman world, in that Gentile world, is that those who were in leadership kind of lorded over. They were like tyrants. They kind of hit their head up high and they kind of looked down on others. And they didn't see, they were not servant leaders. They were more so oppressive tyrants, as it were. And he said, look, this is not the kind of style of leadership that I want you to exhibit. And what Jesus was saying, I don't want this kind or this style of leadership to exist in the church, to exist in religious organizations. And not only in religious organizations, but also in we can see that this should not exist in other community organizations where you have someone functioning and operating as a tyrant. He said, it's not shall be among you, but if you desire to be great, then be the servant. And then he went on to say that what he came into this world to do. He said, I didn't come here to be served. And Jesus was the Prince of Peace. He is the King of Kings. But when he came into this world, as the scripture have told us, he didn't come to be served, but to serve. He washed Peter's feet. And Peter said, no, I don't want you washing my feet. Jesus said, well, look, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me. Peter said, oh, he changed his attitude quick. You can wash my whole body, Jesus. Jesus modeled what it was to look like to be the ultimate servant leader. And if we that are people of faith draw from the examples we see in Scripture, whether it be the Gospels or whether it be the New Testament, or we can go back and look at some of the Old Testament examples as well. If we let the Scriptures be the authority on how to be a servant leader, then we're going to be the best examples that we can be in our church, in our religious organization, or if you're a person of faith that's operating or leading a community service organization or some social service. We can draw from the authority of scriptures to inform how we're to lead as servants. Well, we concluded part 2 on servant leadership, part of our series on core values for faith and community leaders. I hope that you've drawn something from this today to inform your own practice of leadership. We all are called to be servants if we're following after Christ. And he is our greatest example to be the servant leader that he has called us to be. God bless you. I look forward to sharing with you again the next time we're together here on Talking Points. God bless you.